Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I want to talk about theories posited by an Australian psychologist named Dr. Dani Sulikowski. I actually first encountered her work through a video Alexander Grace did, kind of recapping a podcast interview she did about a month ago. And then in the comments of a previous video, one of you noted that she also sat down with Quillette last week and talked about the same stuff, and this came with a transcript. So I wanted to go through the Quillette interview because I think she unpacks a lot of really fascinating stuff. In case you're not familiar with her work, she has a theory that intrasex competition, so competition between women and men, is a leading cause of the fertility crisis, and specifically the competition between women and women is the result of manipulative reproductive suppression. So basically, her theory argues that elite women have convinced other women lower down on the socioeconomic totem pole than them to not have children, to make having children an undesirable proposition. So these women at the top have adopted an anti-natalist position, and this directly correlates and aligns with feminism. So the feminist ideology and more liberal political leanings results in anti-natalism, and she argues that this is a socio-evolutionary scheme by women at the top to basically reduce the competition for their offspring to help them be more successful in the future. And what this has done is this has led to millions of women, billions, frankly, if you want to look at other countries, not just the United States. It's happening all across the West, and as well as in Japan and South Korea. There are billions of women who are just not having children because they've been co-opted by this messaging, this anti-natalist messaging, and a lot of them aren't really aware of it. And I think this is really fascinating from my perspective because I was one of these women. I was a feminist career woman up until just a couple of years ago, and I've done a complete 180. So I can relate to a lot of this and the influence other women and social expectations of society. Society is created by women. So when people say social expectations, they're really talking about women. Men don't really set the expectations in society. Women do. And women are the ones, the purveyors of culture and norms. And so when you talk about those social expectations, it's really coming from women. So I personally experienced the effects of this and how other women shaped expectations about how I should live my life. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago where I kind of woke up from the feminist slumber I was in and realized like I was going down a bad trajectory, and if I didn't course correct very quickly, I was going to end up alone and single for the rest of my life. And I think a lot of women are currently in this position, and I think that's why they're so frustrated with dating, but they're not willing to part ways with their political ideology, and they've put that ahead of their innate biological evolutionary desire to get married, have kids, and raise a family. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff that Dr. Sulikowski talks about. So let's dive in. So she talks in the beginning right from the get-go about competitive reproduction. And she argues that the currency of evolution is reproductive success. So if you have more offspring in the next generation, your genes become overrepresented in that generation. That makes sense. Survival of the fittest. The idea is that if you're paired with someone and you're having kids, just from an evolutionary biological perspective, like your genes are considered desirable. Those traits, those characteristics are going to be carried on into the future. So on the one hand, I think there's a personal desire for legacy, but then I think we're also evolutionarily hardwired to want to survive into the future. Otherwise, it's just a completely suicidal tendency of a species just to not reproduce. It's counter to, I think, how we're hardwired. And she says, what that means is that all individuals are under selection pressure to win that competitive race. That means not just maximizing your own reproductive success, but also minimizing the reproductive success of rivals around you. That's what we call intrasexual competition. So this is a really interesting way to frame it because I hadn't thought of this. So on the one hand, I think there's always been an overt competition. Like women are trying to be more attractive, more beautiful, do certain things to woo male suitors, right? So that's always been kind of the standard and the norm from the female perspective. But there's another component to it. So it's not just winning the race, it's also suppressing your competition. So reducing the competition that is around you. And I think some really good examples of this, not even just ideologically, but physically, is the culture right now to make yourself ugly. Like you just look at how liberals, I'm picking on liberals, but they kind of fit the stereotype, how liberal feminist women dress, how they take care of their bodies, how they groom themselves. I mean, it's a trend to have really grotesque haircuts, like with the bangs up to here, the bull ring in your nose. I mean, that's a clear giveaway of your political beliefs. Just a bunch of like random tattoos on your arms, and I'm not opposed to tattoos. I have one, but it's just like there's something about, I don't know. There's just, it's the way liberal women have done it and feminist women have done it. It's just really unattractive in my opinion. Like I'd much prefer to see someone with like a whole sleeve that has like a story and meaning to it, not just like a random mushroom here, a random piece of pizza here. It's just, for me, that's just not appealing. And then you have the women who dye their hair a certain color, and of course there's the the fat acceptance movement. So this normalization of fatness, which is contrary to all beauty standards. So we've erased, like feminist women have erased beauty standards. They've deliberately made themselves ugly. The way they dress, I find, is very unfeminine and grotesque as well. So that's just one example of something subtle that's been happening in culture that I don't think people are consciously aware of. But it really is one group of women at the top setting a new norm and standard that women underneath them follow. And these women think they're empowered by dressing a certain way and modifying their bodies in a certain way. And they don't realize that this is making them really unattractive to men. Same thing with like the normalization of OF. Like that is completely, like that, look at how that is framed in feminist culture. It's framed as an extension of being a girl boss. It's celebrated. It's something people, like more and more young girls and young women, are striving to do. And they don't realize that that is the ultimate scarlet letter. And once you go through that door, there's no going back. And so they've made it harder for those women to find suitors later on. If you do OF in your 20s, okay, and then maybe you grow up and realize, oh, I want a family, and you get to a point where you're 30 and you're ready to settle down. Not a lot of guys are going to want you, So those are just two examples of how the feminist narrative is shaping, culture right now. But it really goes to this point of there's a group of people that is deliberately creating and carving out this messaging in order to minimize the reproductive success of their rivals. Okay. So one of the things she notes here, and why women in particular are important and why they're the focal point of this, is because compared to men, women are rate limiters of the population. So women basically control fertility. Men can have children infinitely across multiple partners. Like, so long as they're alive, they can reproduce. Women are born with a finite amount of eggs. They have a fertility window that closes once they get older. And so there's only a limited number of children that women can produce. So she says, a population can afford to sacrifice a lot of men in something like a war, and the small number of men left are sufficient to support the women remaining to effectively replace the lost men in one generation. But you can't do the same thing with women. So when you introduce intrasexual competition and narratives that are antinatalist and deter women from having children, you're effectively suppressing the fertility rate. And while, men are replaceable because you can have infinite, like men can reproduce infinitely, if women stop producing children by choice And if they just like close their wombs to business, like that has an actual consequence on civilization, because they are the gatekeepers. They are the ones that control the fertility rate, they control replacement rates, they control the success or failure of your civilization. It's all up to women. Okay, so she says, so now looking at it from the position of intrasexual competition, if a woman wants to increase her net reproductive success, she needs to reproduce at a rate greater than the background population rate, so greater than replacement rate, so she can have more babies. So that's one way you can do it. So if you want your genes to carry on, and you're a competitive woman, and you biologically, evolutionarily, socially, whatever, you want to have, success in the future, you want to have a legacy for yourself and your genes to carry on, just have more babies, right? And there are certain demographics of people where this is absolutely true. Like Catholics are famously picked on for that. They like have no birth control and just have lots and lots of babies. So that's one way you do it. You can have lots and lots of children. But that isn't the only way. So the other way, especially if you're in a cohort of people who aren't having necessarily, you're having kids, but you're not having a lot of kids. Another way to try to reduce the net reproductive rate is by influencing rivals to have fewer children. So this is exactly what is being done by elites at the top. They want their kids to be more successful in the future. They want greater success of their way of life to survive. And so they are not incentivizing, but they are framing motherhood in such a way that women underneath them don't want to have children. Now they're voluntarily not having children. And a great example is, I covered this in a separate video about the declining fertility rate. And I went through an essay that a Cornell professor had in the Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program had published to her Substack. And she gave 5 reasons why you shouldn't have kids under the current Trump administration. And of course, there's the usual suspects, men not pulling their fair share, norms about women and domestic life and all that kind of stuff. But then in the end, she concludes that she had a child. And it was, even though it was a happy accident, like she was really grateful for her child. And so it really frames, when you read it, it's like rules for thee and not for me. And you see this across the board. You see feminist women who are mothers parroting these talking points, telling women like you and I not to have kids, but they're okay with having kids, right? So the Trump administration is bad for you and I, for women like us. We're not supposed to have kids. But for this professor of feminist studies at Cornell, it doesn't apply to her. She's exceptional. She did highlight her eliteness, how she was in an unusual position in that she had tenure as a professor and good health insurance and all that kind of stuff, to make it such that like she could reproduce. And the whole time she derided men and talked about how bad men are and how they don't carry their fair share, but she's married to one, and he was the outlier apparently. So all men are evil except for her husband, who, because he carries the fair share, like he's somehow some sort of saint. It's just you can see it, just the irony of it, how someone would tell you not to have kids, but it doesn't apply to them. And so this is what this is all about. It's, you can have more babies and you can out reproduce your rivals, or you can just convince them not to have kids. And sometimes convincing them not to have kids is actually better. I mean, would you rather have 2 kids or 10 and convince your competitors not to have any? 2 kids and convincing other people not to have them is a far better proposition, especially for women in elite positions of power. So she says, limiting other women's reproductive capacity can lower the overall background rate. Men can't really affect that by limiting other men's reproductive capacity. For the same reason, we can send huge numbers of men off to war and recover in a generation. If a man convinced other men to withdraw from the gene pool, the small number left could still sustain reproduction. So this technique, manipulative reproductive suppression, really only benefits women. When men engage in intrasexual competition, it's a running race. Just have as many babies as you can, eyes on the prize, ignore what everyone else is doing. For women, it's much more about promoting your own reproductive success and investing energy and pulling your competitors back behind you. So this is all about sabotage. And so everything we're seeing right now with feminism and toxic masculinity, men going their own way, the declining fertility rate, all of this has to do with women. Like this is where it's emanating from. It's coming from women, because women have an innate desire to suppress other women. I can tell you this as a woman who grew up in female culture. Like, this is absolutely true. There's no one who's going to explicitly say it. Like, no one's going to admit it. But it's just this constant programming that's in your head to compete, outperform, and sometimes sabotage other women. And if you want an example of this, I've said this in previous videos and I will keep saying it. Go watch the original Mean Girls, the one with Lindsay Lohan, and that is a documentary of girl culture. It really is, to a T, how women treat each other, and it doesn't stop in high school. It continues on into adulthood, and it takes different, it takes different shapes. I mean, just join a mom group on Facebook for a couple days and just read through the chatter, and you'll see, like, women are just downright awful to each other. So it's not surprising to me that she's come up with this theory that women are sabotaging, they're deliberately suppressing the reproductive abilities of other women, not by physical intervention, but by social engineering and cultural control. Okay. So she talks about how it's part of the social discourse that there's a narrative that having children oppresses you, it limits your career, your freedom, and has all these negative impacts. And this is how the suppression is manifesting. Again, from experience, I can tell you this is absolutely true. And throughout my 20s, I believe this. I believe that having children was oppressive. It would hold me back in my career. I would lose something. Like, the moment you have kids, you're done. Your life is over. Okay. And so if you're working towards something, like, you don't want to have kids because you don't want that to hold you back. And so I think this is a common narrative for college educated, career focused women. This idea that children are a destructive force that will hold you back. And then I think compounding this is we've erased families and we've erased children from public life. So, if you think, to your 20s, or, when you were young, like, what did you do for social activities? You probably went to bars, went to restaurants. Okay, how many kids are going out to eat at a small plate fancy restaurant? How many of those facilities even have high chairs for kids? Okay, not many. Kids aren't really going to bars. They are going to breweries, which I have kind of mixed feelings about. They've become more family-friendly places. But if you really think about it and you look at how the infrastructure of a downtown is structured, it really is structured around singles, young adults, not really family-friendly. And then the public places that should be family-friendly, parks and libraries, I mean, they're overrun with homeless people. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I would love to go to the library. Austin has a fantastic public library. But it's kind of a crapshoot when you go. And it's not just Austin. I've, traveled the whole country and been to lots of different libraries. And it's pretty common throughout the country. If you're in a big-ish city, there's going to be a homeless problem. And a lot of those people are going to loiter inside libraries. So even spaces that could otherwise be designed for mixed-use singles and families, there's an incentive for families really not to go to these spaces. So we've erased kids from public life. So it's not even just the discourse, what you're being told, it's also subconsciously being reinforced by the fact that you don't see kids. And then when you do, think about the last time you flew on an airplane. When you do see a kid, you see them as a nuisance. Like, how many times have you flown on an airplane and there's been an annoying kid or a crying kid behind you, and all you can think about is, oh my gosh, I can't believe there's a screaming toddler on this flight, right? Like, we don't have like a positive outlook on kids even when they are present. They've kind of been, shut out of public life altogether. And so I think that is part of this. So she says, my argument around feminism is that I used to say it began as a movement interested in women's place in society, but was co-opted by what's effectively become reproductive suppression. Now, I think feminism was always an attack on reproductive output. That's all it's ever been, and I think you can explain it from the beginning to end with that one principle. And I think there's merit to this. One of the examples you can look to is the founding of Planned Parenthood. So when Planned Parenthood was founded, and Planned Parenthood is a good example because it has become the paragon of modern political feminism here in the United States. When Planned Parenthood was founded, it was founded on the premise of eugenics. And so family planning and contraception for Planned Parenthood wasn't about like preventing unwanted pregnancies like it's used today. Back when Planned Parenthood was founded, it was to prevent certain groups of people within society not to reproduce. So it was mostly targeting Black women. And so it's ironic that feminists would rally around an organization like Planned Parenthood, knowing full well the history of it and what it was founded on. It was founded on reducing the reproductive capacity of Black women who, during the 1920s, 1930s, eugenics was very popular. It was believed to be like a scientific theory that had credibility, and it often fell along racial lines. So they wanted Black women not to reproduce, and so they introduced contraception in order to make that happen. And so I think there's definitely something to this. It's about reducing reproductive output, and it hasn't always been explicit or overt. I think there's some social and cultural engineering that has been happening behind the scenes to make it happen. Okay. So she talks about here kind of why women are so afraid of having kids and why it's been cast as being oppressive. And so this is actually the interviewer, but she adds a little anecdote here that I think is worth calling attention to. But she says, pretty much the worst thing you could do in her eyes was drop out of school, year 10, not do the HSC. I think that's some sort of Australian test maybe. Marry a guy, become a hairdresser, or get some other trade, and become a young mom. That was the most socially embarrassing, low-class, low-intelligence thing you could do. And I think that is absolutely true. I come from kind of a similar working-class background. My mother now has her bachelor's degree, but growing up, neither of my parents had a bachelor's degree. She went back to school after my brother and I started college, so we were all in school at the same time. But growing up, I was not in a college-educated household. My dad worked in manufacturing for his entire career. And I was surrounded by people who were hairdressers, who, did work at body shops, and who were like plumbers and tradesmen, and, my uncle's a woodworker, so that was the world I grew up in. And right before college, I was in the honors program in high school. So I got to take classes with the children of doctors and lawyers and engineers. So I slowly got introduced to their way of thinking and their mindset. And then by the time I went to college and kind of got fully indoctrinated with all the liberal ideologies, I definitely feared this. And in Washington, D.C., where I started my career, like this was something that was constantly in the back of my mind. It wasn't even just a fear of this anymore. It was a rejection of this. And it was a suppression of like my own upbringing. And I had a lot of anger and resentment for a really long period of time towards my parents and towards, where I grew up, because I didn't come from like an elite background like everyone else. And so when the friends I had made, the colleagues and coworkers I had come to make acquaintances with in Washington, D.C., basically the entirety of my professional circle, when they talked disparagingly against people who were in the trades, when they talked disparagingly about people who didn't go to college, like I unconsciously had to adopt that. Like I had to adopt their way of thinking in order to belong in the group, to be part of the tribe. And because I so desperately wanted to belong to the socioeconomic elite circle of people in Washington, D.C., I had to behave like they behaved, dress how they behaved, and think how they thought. And of course, like I said, I've done a complete 180, and I've more or less gone back to my original roots and realized like all of that was a bunch of malarkey. But I think this is true. I think, young women who come from places like I did, I came from a Rust Belt town in upstate New York where there really wasn't a lot of economic opportunity. You go to school, you're told to climb the career ladder, you're eyeing social mobility. And in doing so, you begin to look down on people who are different than you. And it's not necessarily that, hairdressers are dumb or they're low class. It's just how it's been framed in society. And so part of this is adopting the identity and the views of the class you want to be part of. And so if the cultural and social elites of society are telling you not to have children because it's oppressive and it'll hurt your career, and implicitly reinforcing the idea that career is the most important thing, like that's the mindset you're going to adopt. That's the values you're going to hold on to. Okay, and then she goes on to say, but now I look at the girls who did do that, who did drop out of school, or maybe didn't go to uni, got a job, and became mothers in their early 20s. They're really happy. A lot of them, not all, obviously. You can't fully generalize. But they've had their kids. Now they're 30. They've pretty much had at least 2, maybe 3, or they're going to have more. And they seem financially quite stable. The ones who ended up with tradies, they own their own businesses. It's just funny to see how much, I have to admit, I mock that too. I thought it was a sign of low sass and lowbrow. Now with hindsight and maturity, I think it's a very enviable position that I hope to emulate in the next few years. I think this is absolutely true. I mean, this is the path I took. It's, I left my career and have been, writing and working from the ground up. But it's much more preferable to have some stability, like build your own business, but have flexibility so you can have family as well. Like, I'm never going to work in a high profile corporate office ever again. I'm completely fine with that. And I'm never going to have to choose between, taking care of my kid or, working. Like, I can still do writing. I can still do like these videos. I can still do things that, have a professional aspect to them, that make money, that satisfy my own intellectual curiosity. But I'm not going to be like handicapped by, a 9-to-5 corporate job. And that's because I've chosen to design a life for myself where that's possible. And there's trade-offs, of course, and it's not easy, and it requires a lot of give and take. But I think decoupling my identity from the feminist identity the career feminist specifically identity that I donned when I worked in DC, I think that has been a huge part of it. But realizing that everything we had been told to do by the feminists, it wasn't actually true. It didn't lead to the outcomes and the promise of a happy life that I think feminists like to think they're living. And so I definitely can resonate with what she's saying here. Okay. So she goes on to say, what it reflects is how much of this is coming down from what people refer to as the elite. It's a bit of a nebulous term. Who actually decides who gets to be elite? But somehow we all know what we mean by it. Cultural influencers. And this is absolutely true. So we know there are certain things the elite do. They go to university, they get the degrees and so on. Is very much the elite who are pushing the anti-reproductive narratives. Everything that is feminist began in the universities. That's a university ideology that has escaped the ivory tower and is now mainstream. It keeps reinventing itself to match whatever would be the most reproductively inhibiting narrative of the day. But it's the elite pressure put on the people below. And so how this is transmitting is it's coming from universities, so people are learning it. They're, especially careerism and the idea of like you have to go to college to get a degree, to get a good job, to live a good life. This whole narrative of the college to career pipeline, I think is definitely part of it. And then you have people who are influencing society from a cultural level who are also reinforcing this. And a great example is, let's compare Kim Kardashian to Hannah Neeleman. I think everyone knows Kim Kardashian, but if you don't know who Hannah Neeleman is, she's the founder of Ballerina Farm. She's a Mormon wife. I think she has 8 kids now, but she has a huge presence on social media. They own a dairy farm, like they're producing milk on their dairy farm. They have a bunch of products, so they sell like protein powders. And I think they started with like sourdough starter, but they have all these different products. They just opened a farm stand, like a small, cute little farm stand near where they live in Utah. So she's a business owner. She's frankly no different than Kim Kardashian. But if you look at society, who is held up to a higher esteem? Kim Kardashian. We're all told to look like her, transform our bodies, do what Kim Kardashian does. Women aren't told to look at Hannah Neeleman as an example of success. In fact, there's been a ton of hit pieces written about Hannah Neeleman, about how her husband oppresses her and how she had to give up her ballet career. But oh, by the way, there's a shelf life on being a ballerina. Like, it's not a very long one. You don't see many ballerinas in their 30s. Okay. And so, but she's done great stuff. Like, I think last year she competed in a beauty pageant, I think for Miss Utah or Mrs. Utah or something, like a week or two after giving birth. And feminists went crazy because she did that. And so this is what she's talking about here with like cultural influencers. Like, there's the positive reinforcement, go be, a Bonnie Blue, go be a Kim Kardashian. And then there's the negative aspect, don't be Hannah Neeleman. Making homemade sandwiches for your kids and raising that many kids, that's inferior. That's, this cultural MAGA Maha agenda. It's all this like conservative conspiracy. And that's how it's being framed. And so that's what's happening. So it's not even just, and that's why you have to look at the positive and the negative space within culture. It's not even just what they're saying to do, it's also what they're saying not to do and how that is being framed and transmitted. But, look at those influencers, but look at the media, music, movies, TV shows. How many things highlight and venerate mothers and cast motherhood in a good light? Everything's about being a girl boss. I mean, I think Apple just had to cancel, I think it was Jessica Chastain was in it, a girl boss show about going after white supremacists because of everything that happened, that's been happening here in the United States. It was a great example. Like, how many shows are, Hollywood executives putting out celebrating motherhood compared to girl bosses? Everything is about a girl boss. Very rarely do you see things about families or positive things about families. Like, almost every single Disney movie, there's an evil stepmother. The father dies when the princess is young. Like, there's just all this subtle messaging that is being disseminated to young girls who grow up with it, internalize it, and normalize it. And then once they enter their careers, go to college and all that stuff, they're fully indoctrinated with feminism, and they believe like having kids and getting married and starting a family is the worst thing in the world. Okay. So she goes on to say it's absolutely the case that women today who are delaying pregnancy until their early 30s are well past whatever would be the ideal peak time. So she's talking about timing with regard to fertility and having kids. When you balance off the risks of choosing a long-term partner and being confident that it's a good partner choice versus having children early enough that your body is still at its peak fertility, not just for pregnancy, but for raising children, which requires a lot of energy. So anyone with children knows what happens for the next, I don't know, my daughter's 5. Okay. But she says, but between 0 and 5, you don't get much sleep. And that's a lot easier for someone in their mid to late 20s to deal with than it is for someone like me. I'm 46 now. I had a very late baby. So she had her first child when she was 41. So this is the trend. So instead of women having children in their peak fertile years, so not saying like when you're 18 start having kids, but maybe like when you're 23, 24, 25, 26, like in your mid 20s, women are being told not to do that because of this manipulative, reproductive, suppressive messaging coming from feminists at the top. They're told to delay, and they're told, you can freeze your eggs, that's fine. That you're being told, wait till you're settled in your career, wait till you get to know yourself better. Wait till you're financially stable. They're just wait, right? That's the messaging. So by the time you get to your 30s, there's new challenges that arise. And so one of the things she talks about here is that, raising kids, it takes a lot of work, a lot of energy. So yeah, while you might have the financial resources or more financial resources to take care of your kids when you're older, you're not going to necessarily have the physical or mental, same physical or mental ability to do so. So it's going to change your ability to parent. And, I think a great corollary for me is I had a business when I lived in Washington, D.C. I've talked about this before in other videos. But when I was, 26, 27, I had no problem, not going to say no problem, but it was much more feasible then than definitely today of working a 9-to-5 job and then immediately after work going to the kitchen, producing oat milk from 5 p.m. till 10, 11, I run marathons, so add that to the mix, going home, waking up, getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning, getting my run in, going to work, doing it all over again. Like, that was my life for several years. And I was able to pull that off because when you're younger, you have more stamina, you're more capable of doing so. And, now I'm 34 and, I go to bed at like 9 o'clock at night, so wake up early, but, I'm a grandma. Like, there's just certain things I can't do. If, an all-nighter, for example, like, imagine going back to your college years, like when you were 20, you could do an all-nighter. Lots of students do all-nighters, but when you're 30, no, like, you can't do all-nighters anymore. So this is something women aren't really considering. Like, yes, there's a biological clock that you have to consider and your fertility window, and it becomes more difficult and you become more at risk the older you get. But there's also other components as well, like just having the energy to be able to raise kids. So maybe if you start having kids in your, mid-20s, you could space them out more. Maybe you could handle having 3, 4, 5 kids. But if you're in your mid-30s, okay, maybe you're only going to deal with 2. And so that's where some of the reproductive suppression comes in. It's not even necessarily that women aren't having kids. It's maybe they're also having fewer kids because they're having kids later, and they're just not able to have as many kids as they would have if they were younger. Okay, so she says all leftist narratives are aligned with 2 things. And she talks about, and she kind of goes on a tangent here, talking about like the incompatibility and inconsistency with different leftist narratives. So she talks about Queers for Palestine, which I think is a fantastic example. Like, those are 2 completely incompatible ideologies. Like, in no universe does, political Islam and LGBTQ people get along. But that's beside the point. But she talks about how leftist narratives have things in common, and it has to do with her whole theory about reproductive suppression. So the first is reproductive suppression. That explains the feminism. It brings the trans ideology, in the trans ideology and the queer narrative, so why feminists have aligned with trans ideology, which again is a complete incoherent inconsistency. Like, no actual feminist should be supporting biological men competing with and displacing women in professional competitive fields of sport. That is just completely antithetical. And yet that's the world we're living in. We're living in a world where simply wearing a dress and wearing makeup and calling yourself a woman makes you a woman. And feminist liberal women have accepted that and normalized that. So that is part of reproductive suppression. But she says, I think it also brings in a lot of the net zero narratives and the tremendous harm they're doing to the economy. It's very anti-natalist. So all this is about not having kids. And she says, at its heart, feminism is anti-woman. Most of the things it espouses end up being bad for women, not good. And this is absolutely true. Like, what good has feminism brought us? A lot of feminist women, and I've heard this argument, I've done videos on this, they'll say, well, it gave you access to banking. Like, if it weren't for feminists, like, you wouldn't be able to do these YouTube videos, you wouldn't be able to receive money and bank and yada yada yada. And my response is, one, they're completely wrong with confusing the ability to bank with the ability to access credit. And if you look at those 2 things, you realize, okay, accessing credit wasn't actually a good thing for women, because now women have tremendous amounts of debt. I mean, they're the leading student debtors in this country. I'm one of them. Like, I have student debt for, a bunch of bullshit degrees that, to my credit, I did start my career actually using them, but, they've turned out not to be the return on investment that, I thought they were supposed to be. And so has giving women access to unsecured credit, has giving women liability, financial liability for their decisions, has that been a net good thing for women? I would say probably not. And I'm not saying, like, undo what's been done. I'm not saying take away credit from women. That's kind of the world we live in now. But compare that to the past. In the past, yeah, women didn't have access to credit cards. They had to, have a cosigner, typically their husband, sign with them. But that's because the man, in traditional marriages and in the way, like, society used to be structured, carried the financial liability of the household. So a woman couldn't go into debt without her husband's permission because he was the one underwriting her, right? So he was the financial guarantor of his household. And so that's one of the reasons why, like, women have always been encouraged to date up and to marry up, and to climb socioeconomically from a marriage perspective, was because of that, because men historically have always been the providers and the financial guarantors for them and their ability, to participate economically within society. So do I think stripping that from women, giving them their own credit cards, telling them to spend all willy-nilly, and then not holding them accountable for their decisions when they end up going into hundreds of thousands of dollars into college student loan debt, and then working, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 jobs, doing marketing or, editorial stuff in New York City? Like, do I think that's been a net win for women? No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. So I think she has something, really good to say here. That's not necessarily, feminism isn't the pro-women ideology I think a lot of people have been told it is. So alongside that, what we're seeing is not just manipulative reproductive suppression occurring in isolation, it's becoming systemic. We're creating a society that is hostile to reproduction. Again, I've said this before with like erasing children from society, but also just strongly encouraging is the wrong word, strongly telling women that having a child and getting married is going to destroy their careers. It's going to destroy their lives. Like framing reproduction as destructive. That's how it's become hostile in our society. Okay, so the interviewer says, if I understand your position correctly, you believe we're in this antinatalist phase where women are suppressing other women's reproductive capacity because society has reached a level of comfort and wealth that makes that possible. And she's absolutely right here. This is she's kind of just reframing this just to bring us back to the thesis of the conversation, and then is going to dive deeper into what this means from a civilizational level and historically speaking. But one thing I want to note here that she highlights, because she talks about reaching a level of comfort and wealth, is what reproductive suppression is it's a luxury belief. And that means what feminism is. Feminism is a luxury belief. And this is something Rob Henderson coined and has talked about. This idea that the people who espouse these beliefs have the ability to espouse them because none of the consequences directly affect them, right? So if you are an elite, if you're like that Cornell professor I referenced before, someone who's already had a child and might not be concerned with having more child, but you have at least one, you're not concerned about your ability to not have children. You're in a very different position than, say, a 36, 37-year-old single millennial woman who has not had children and is reaching the end of her fertility window, of her years that she's able to have children. Very different position. And so I think that's what makes it a luxury belief. Okay. So she talks here about infant mortality and the birth rate, and why, when you have you've had a drop in infant mortality over the years just because of sanitation and advances in medicine, and she says you'd expect the birth rate to go down and then level off at some new equilibrium based on these better conditions. So as sanitation and maternal mortality go down, you'd expect a new equilibrium, but that's not what's happening. She says what we observe is that birth rates keep falling. They don't stabilize, they bottom out, and that's a really interesting phenomenon. I think the reason that happens is because of female manipulative reproductive suppression. So as society becomes more developed, women gain time and resources. Mothers can now get the same number of surviving children with fewer pregnancies. So in the past, you had to have 10 and maybe 2 would survive. Now you can have 2 or 3 kids and about 2 or 3 are going to survive. These women have more freedom, more opportunity, but also here's the critical point. The women who were previously elite because they had wealth and better access to survival factors no longer enjoy that advantage. Everyone now has sanitation. Everyone now has antibiotics and clean water. So basically, all the technological advances that benefited the elites in the past now benefit everyone else beneath them. And so they don't have the same advantages that they once did. So the wealthy lose their edge unless they do something new to maintain it. And what they do is use their excess resources and time to suppress the reproductive success of other women. And I wanted to draw a corollary here because I don't think modern women would really consider like sanitation as a pretty big issue. But this is something Thomas Malthus brought up with regard to overpopulation. So he was part of a school of thinkers and economists in the early 19th century in the UK. Who were talking about different theories about economics. And one of the theories he came up with, which has been disproven, but it was the idea that population would increase at a rate that was faster than agricultural production. So at the time, Europe was in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, but definitely still highly agrarian. And he argued that because the population in the UK was growing, it was growing at such a fast pace, the land wouldn't be able to sustain the growing population. We know that's not true because there have been advances in farming techniques, which has made it possible for agriculture production to keep up with exponential population growth. But anyways, during his time when he was around, some of the conversations that were happening in intellectual circles among economists was how to bring the birth rate down, how to curb fertility. And a lot of this anti-natalist thinking comes from Thomas Malthus, who's been disproved, but they still, rely on it. It's this idea that we have to curb the population. We can't let it grow too much. And so one of the ways, he wrote a bunch of different pamphlets and treatises about this, but one of the things he recommended was using sanitation as a weapon against the poor. So because the poor in 19th century Europe were cloistered in these, urban ghettos, basically, think of like tenement housing here in the U.S. in New York City in, the 1900s. People were packed in like sardines into these cities. So a disease would spread like wildfire. And so he would recommend, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also kind of serious, that one of the ways to control the population, if you couldn't, send the men off to fight a war, was to induce disease into the poorer sections of a city. And to do that would be to disrupt sanitation, make it unsanitary to live there, because when you lack sanitation, that's where diseases spread. So this is like an opinion that has been around for a while. And so it's nothing, like, we don't really relate to that today. I think we take sanitation for granted. But it shows that this isn't just like a novel, crazy idea. This was actually something the elites of 19th century Europe were talking about. And so now, they have to come up with new things to do. And so part of that is social engineering. So how do you do social engineering? Well, you control the media narrative. You control the creation of media. So, Hollywood, major news outlets. You promote things on social media, and you put your financial resources behind that. So you're not necessarily directly advocating for killing people, as someone like Thomas Malthus was, but you're not necessarily allocating your resources towards their success either. And that's where a lot of this comes into play. Okay. So she talks today about feminism and the standards women impose on other women. And she says the standard is created and policed primarily by women. So she says, one of the reasons why women aren't having as many children is because of the perception that it's too expensive, it's too costly to have kids. But what people don't realize is that the minimum threshold, the basic requirements for having kids has changed over time. So whereas in the past, like something like summer camp, for example, would have been a luxury that not everyone did, now it's a requirement. So if you are, a woman in your 20s or 30s and you feel like you're not going to be in a place where in a couple of years you're not going to have the money to afford good daycare and summer camp, you're not going to have kids because you don't want to deprive your kids of opportunities. And I have friends who have had kids. They're several years older than me, but this was definitely their mindset. Like, they wanted their kid. They were kind of like the Tiger Moms equivalent, but they want their kids to have the best of everything, want to make sure they could spend as much as they could. And so there's this financial perception within a lot of women's minds that they have to be able to give their kids more than really what is realistically necessary. Like, there's a lot of people having kids on far less. There's a lot of kids that grow up and become wonderful adults, contributing members of society that never went to summer camp, and they're doing just fine. But it's created this arbitrary standard, kind of like Keeping Up with the Joneses, right? It's created this standard that women hold each other accountable to. So she says, instead of having enough wealth to easily raise children, people are pressured into spending their limited wealth on things that don't help with reproduction at all, just to maintain social status. And this is absolutely true. If you feel pressured to spend money and you feel like you need to have a certain amount of money saved up before having kids in order to maintain your social status, it's going to disincentivize you from having kids in the first place. This creates a world where the poor can no longer afford to have children. Meanwhile, the elite women who can meet all these standards and also provide for their children, get their reproductive advantage back. They've created a system that artificially raises the cost of motherhood, and in doing so, they suppress the fertility of the classes below them. This explains consumerism, fashion trends, the obsession with lifestyle products. It's all part of a broader system. We've created a world where being acceptable in society means spending on things that have nothing to do with reproductive success. And that is absolutely true. Just look at how advertising is targeted, who it's targeted to, what it's targeting about, and that tells you all you know. Like, almost every single mom product out there isn't about like safety and the health and well-being of your kid. It's like to guilt you into getting it, because if you don't get this for your kid and every other kid has it, like, you're a bad parent. You're not a good enough mom if they miss out on this opportunity. Like, you're a bad person. And so there's this guilt and shame component to motherhood as well, based on what you can and can't afford. And again, like, looking back to my own upbringing, this was absolutely true. People do all sorts of activities, recreational soccer, and I did ballet, but there was a period of time where I was doing sports teams. So I had softball, and I did soccer for a while, but mostly softball, and they're basketball too. But I reached a point where, like, I couldn't do more because the next level was travel league. And so over time, there's been a normalization of travel sports. So it's not even that, like, I don't even know if kids just do recreational, like, community soccer leagues anymore. Like, everyone is doing a travel team or a competitive dance team, or there's this or there's that. And so, like, over time, the requirements of successfully raising a child has become more and more expensive. So if you're a young person today, you're looking at that, you're looking at the culture you grew up in, you're looking at where society is, and you're like, I can't afford this. Like, this costs way too much money. Like, even if it's several years out, even if you have a kid, today, and you're not going to enroll them into, ballet for a couple of years, and they're definitely not going to be a competitive ballerina at the age of 3, I can tell you that. You're still psychologically thinking these things, and women think about this all the time. And so this is, I think, completely spot on. She's made it so that the poor can no longer afford to have children, and it's not so much that they financially can't. And there are costs to having kids are expensive. I get that, but there's a perception that they can't have children. So it's not affecting women who are at the poverty level. It's more affecting women who are middle class, who are barely able to afford their own lifestyles where they're at currently, let alone adding the costs of a child and childcare to the mix. And so she says here, as women gain influence in institutions, those institutions become hostile to reproductive. So this is what she means by all this becoming more systemic, is women have entered into different positions of power, and they have introduced their feminist ideology, which is anti-woman, anti-natalist ideology, into those institutions. And so they've become more hostile to reproduction. And, a great example is the childcare problem, right? So a lot of women lament the cost of childcare. There was a book I was reading about the closure of the GM plant in Janesville, Wisconsin. And in it, it talks about another local company. It was called the Parker Pen Company. And there's a woman who recounts her time joining the Parker Pen Company, and how in that company, like, births were celebrated and you were just given time off. There wasn't like this, you had to save up PTO or take a reduced salary or forfeit your job. Like, because the companies in the past were so tightly integrated with the communities that they were part of, like, it was just a given that if a woman within a company had a kid, she got the leave she needed. Like, there wasn't pressure like there is today. And so I think this is a great examples. Like, okay, women have gained all this power and the status of CEOs, but very few are doing anything to support other women. Very few are doing anything to encourage motherhood. They're just perpetuating their own feminist ideologies. So there's plenty of evidence that they went through. Okay, she's talking now about ancient civilizations, so Rome and Arab civilizations. She says there's plenty of evidence that they went through the same sequence: the feminization of institutions, the elite over-consuming, birth rates declining, collapse. So she's talking about the impact of feminization within institutions in a society and how that is part of the bigger problem of cyclical societal collapse. So she says, so if it just ended with collapse every time, it would be selected out, but it's not, which suggests that someone's lineage are surviving, collapsing, and founding the next civilization. So this is why suppression is happening, because history is cyclical. It's not linear like we think. And so, you can look back at history and you can see kind of where we are in our own civilization and kind of predict where we're going to go. So elite overconsumption tends to be a harbinger for collapse, widening wealth gap, all that kind of stuff. Birth rates decline as people can no longer afford to have children, and then that leads to collapse because you're not replacing the population that's dying, and eventually you're going to have too few people to carry on your civilization forward. But she's arguing here that at the beginning of this cycle is the feminization of institutions. And so part of this is a larger, almost a conspiracy in some ways. And again, I don't think this is conscious. I don't think women are consciously thinking about this, but it's part of a broader conspiracy to ensure that your offspring survive and thrive. And so whoever is having children now, they're going to be the future. And I've done a separate video on this as well. But the fact that feminists aren't having as many children and they're encouraging other women beneath them not to have children, they're promoting these anti-natalist policies. Those women, like that aspect of Western civilization is going to die out. So you have to look at who is having children. Well, it's religious conservative women. So the future is largely going to be shaped by the offspring of the women who are having children. So if you want to survive into the future, and you want your genes and your genealogy to survive, you need to make it possible for them to do so. And so if you reduce the competition, you're making it possible for the next for your offspring to contribute to the next civilization that replaces a declining one. So it's the women driving the collapse who end up being the ones who do reproduce, while everyone else is slowly discouraged, manipulated, or priced out of reproduction. And the next civilization is founded by their descendants. So this is like the macro big picture. This is what it's all about. So the interviewer says, and you say that the women who promote these ideas, these anti-natalist ideas, actually do go on to have children anyway. And like I said, this is true. I mean, it's rules for thee, not for me. It's not easy, though, to separate those who are architects of the suppression from those who are victims of it, but who also promote it. Think of it like a pyramid scheme. You get a few people at the top who know it's a grift, and they convince others to join and spread it. So again, it's not necessarily conscious. Just women are kind of blindly participating in it without thinking about what they're doing. Many of the women promoting these ideas aren't consciously sabotaging others. They've fallen for it themselves, and that makes them the most effective evangelists because they have internalized to believe what they think to be true, even though it's not necessarily true. I don't think most Gen Z and millennial women, especially, are consciously aware of feminist ideology and the impact it's had on their lives. They just take everything for granted. They just accept it as is and that it's a good thing, and they leave it at that. They see the children of the so-called elites, these super educated women with amazing partners who travel and live exciting lives, and that becomes the standard for what a cool girl is. Okay, so she's talking here about how elites are setting the standard that other women are following. It's not just that they what they wear or do, it's the beliefs that become attached, the correct opinions to have. And again, I said this about my own experience in Washington, D.C., but this is true, is you see what you're told what to look at for success. So you look at, high profile women in corporate offices, famous musicians, celebrities, social media influencers. You're told to look at them as the pinnacles of success. They set the standard, and they kind of tell you what to do and how to believe. And so you follow their pattern because you want to emulate them. You want to be just like them. So, and with that regard, there becomes correct opinions to have and incorrect opinions to have. And so the interviewer here, she's talked about how she's suffered from being in girls' groups and being kicked out for not going along with the beliefs. It's genuinely painful, almost more painful than a romantic relationship breakdown. I found it on par, even worse. It's so socially hurtful. Anyway, all this is to say the sort of aspirational middle-class girls are getting these opinions and stand from the upper class. And I've just seen the average girls I grew up with going along with the opinions that I find extreme, like from a university educated mindset. And so this is kind of what I've been saying. And so all of this distills down. So that's how a working class girl from a Rust Belt town like me ended up going to Washington, D.C. and buying into all of this feminist bullshit, is because I was told I needed, college was good, social mobility is good, I should aspire to do great and wonderful things. Here are the paragons of success I should look towards. I should emulate them. And because I want to be part of the in group, I want to belong, I have to adhere to the same beliefs as they do. And she talks about this here with some of the social signaling you've probably seen in recent years. That has to do with some of this ideology. So, Free Palestine, the black square on Instagram after George Floyd's death, pronouns in their bios. These are all signals that relate back to an ideology that most people are just going with. They're just doing what they think they need to do to be part of the in group. But they don't actually necessarily believe these things. And for some people, it's contrary to what they truly do believe, but they're too afraid to say something because they don't want to be kicked out of the group. And again, watch Mean Girls. Great example of how girl groups can be really awful to one another. Okay. She says, social policing among women is very different. Male friendships just aren't structured that way. And I think this is true. She, talked before in the beginning about how men are just racing. They're eye on the prize. I want to have family. I want to have kids. That's all they care about. Whereas women, it's a more strategic game of success and sabotage and how we police one another with how we behave. And men don't do that. And that's why I think women are so catty and mean. Like, guys can go do fun bro things and have not a care in the world. And everything women do has to be calculated and thought through. And this is one of the reasons why, I don't have a lot of female friends. I have some, close ones, but I'm not going to brunch on the weekends with a squad of girlfriends. That just has never happened and will never happen. Because I hate the social policing. I've, been privy to it, observed it, and I just hate it. So I don't participate in it. Okay. She says, now she goes on to say, I think that's something that's seriously underappreciated. The power that women have to dictate to each other what is and isn't allowed. What you can wear, think, say, believe, endorse, support. People underestimate just how much power that has among women. And you're absolutely right about the symbols, pronouns in the bio, the flag, the slogan. The people don't understand that they're even advocating for it. And if they did understand, they probably wouldn't support it. They just know these are the right things to say to stay in the group. And we've seen this over the last 5 years in the post-COVID world. Just look around you, look at all the social signaling that had to be done, and you can clearly see it. So she says, if your main motivation is social inclusion, to be liked and accepted, then why waste time thinking critically? This is why this has become a problem, why it's become this blanket thing where anything that's on the ideological docket for feminists just is automatically included. Because it's a waste of time for women to think critically. You'll be socially punished if you do, so people suppress the truth, even from themselves. And as you discovered, once you see through it, those friendships become untenable. So it makes perfect sense that people who are highly socially motivated just go along with the group. There's no benefit to discovering the truth, just social risk. That's why people respond aggressively when you try to explain it to them. You're threatening their whole social structure. They need that ignorance. That ignorance is what allows them to keep living the way they're living. And you're absolutely right. The average person's beliefs are a social signal, not a deep philosophical stance. The reason they get so angry when challenged is because the belief was never based on logic. It's not about ideas. It's about group membership. And I think I really love this conversation because I think she kind of ties some knots and brings some things full circle that I think we're seeing here in the United States. And it's really hard to understand why people are acting against their interests. Why would women support biological men coming into their spaces, competing with them in sports? Why on earth is that a thing? And you can see it's part of this desire to socially belong. So if you have a group at the top who was saying, this is the new protocol. These are the social rules that everyone has to abide by. And you're disseminating that to women below. They have a strong desire to be members of the club and be included. And we saw this post-COVID, right? If you deviated from the narrative, if you questioned anything, you were canceled. Folks on the left were telling people not to go spend Christmas and Thanksgiving with their family. Even in this last election in 2024, it was strongly advocated by people in the mainstream media. If you had a family member who voted for Trump and you did not, it was okay to cut them off. It was okay not to go to Thanksgiving dinner. So the conversation has been to isolate yourself from family members who disagree with you, to end friendships. And that has been normalized over the past 5 years. And that's what people have been doing. And so a lot of feminist women aren't critically thinking about why they believe what they believe and how it affects like the big picture, like civilizationally speaking. Like, I'm not even just talking about, whether or not you're going to have kids or get married or not. It's, if I don't have kids and you don't have kids and everyone else doesn't have kids, Western civilization is done. Like, this entire thing is done. The American project, done. So it's not even just like a selfish individual thing anymore. Like, there's this bigger macro picture that very few people are looking at and having a conversation about, especially feminist women. Okay. So in the past, socioeconomic status used to predict how many children people had, and it was inverted. So in the past, usually poorer people had more children and wealthier people didn't. And this kind of goes back to wealthier people having like more resources, better health and sanitation, that kind of stuff. But now kind of things have inverted a bit. And so she says, socioeconomic status doesn't predict how many children women will have. It suggests that these antinatalist narratives are filtering further down the socioeconomic ladder. Political orientation is still a big predictor. Women who endorse left-wing narratives, who are more progressive, are much more antinatalist and have fewer children. Conservative women are still having more children than leftist women. And so that is certainly true, and you're seeing that in the data. But she's talking about how it's inverting, and that you're seeing people at the top starting to have more children. So she says female CEOs, the women at the very top of organizations, are actually having more children than the women one or two rungs below them. And so she's looking at this as evidence of manipulative reproductive suppression. And that, you're not even just talking about like the bookkeeper at the very, very bottom of a company. It's, the vice presidents and the directors and people of some degree of professional and social status and financial well-being. They're not having children. So it's the ones at the top who are, but the ones just beneath them aren't. Okay. Okay, so she says here, she says, we're beginning to see evidence that it's the elites who are bucking the trend and reproducing successfully. And that having kids has become almost an accessory in some ways, and what makes someone elite. And so Dr. Sulikowski here says, except they don't want anyone else to follow what they're doing. So they're having kids, rules for thee, not for me. And they don't want anyone else to follow them. So they're not being vocal about their own pronatal choices. They're being very vocal about the benefits of antinatalism. But they're very quiet about their own reproductive behavior because they don't want to be modeled by others. They're doing it, but they don't want anyone else doing it. So an example of this is toxic masculinity. And so this has come to shape conversations within feminist circles. And this is an example of the antinatalist messaging that is being broadcast to the rest of women. So she says it's become the center of gravity in all discussions about men. And she says you can't gain a relative reproductive advantage for yourself by manipulating the opposite sex's output. You have to do it within your own sex. So the attacks on toxic masculinity aren't really about men. They're about women's mate preferences. What these narratives are doing is disrupting other women's mate preferences. They're demonizing everything that makes a man a good partner. They demonize masculinity. They demonize a man's tendency to protect. They demonize a man's desire to provide. So feminist narratives are having the effect of inverting female mate preferences and directing women towards men who will be less likely to be good partners, fathers, and providers. And you can see this in the discourse right now. Conservative men aren't looked upon very favorably by liberal feminist women. They want someone who's going to provide, but they also want to be an equal partner in their relationship. They don't want to be a wife. They don't want to be a mother. But they've demonized all of these aspects of masculinity, of these things that make men who they are. And the replacement has been with, very soft liberal men who aren't necessarily the best mate choice. And a good example here would be compare like a blue collar tradesman to a software engineer, right? Up until now, most liberal women have been told, go mate with the guy, go settle down and have kids and start a family with the guy who has a college degree. A lot of women, this is a qualifier that they want. They will not date anyone who does not have a college degree. Well, guess what? The intellect between the software engineer and the tradesman might not be as different as you think. I think a lot of women put down tradesmen and have no idea who these guys are and what they have to offer. But the problem here and how it relates to suppression is that we've venerated and elevated white collar positions and men with college degrees. But these guys are going to be on the front lines of losing their jobs to automation. So already software engineers, guys who 5-6 years ago were making $200,000-$300,000 a year, now can't find a job. And good luck if you're just out of college looking for a job. Compare that with guys in the trades who are making comparable amounts of money. They just don't flaunt it or talk about it. This is a really good example. So the preference for blue collar guys, because of the conversations that are happening within culture and how women police one another and how women disparage choices and that kind of stuff. This is part of it. It's looking down on the ones who actually can provide, who are masculine, who know how to use their hands, who have real skills, actual tools, know how to do things. And the preference has been redirected towards a bunch of, guys working bullshit jobs in tech startups. And that's been the preference. But those guys, they're some are liberal leaning, so they don't necessarily have, in my opinion, the best moral framework. But these guys are going to be at the front end of automation and displacement. So they're not going to be the best candidates for sustaining, family life in the coming years as we go through this technological disruption that we're in. So that's I think a really good example of how these narratives are disrupting mate preferences. Is that women have been told that certain types of men are bad, even though those types of men are the good guys. They're the ones who are going to be the ones to provide. They're going to be the ones who can step up to the plate and provide and do the things that need to be done. Frankly, the soft, squishy software engineer who's used to being fed by Google 3 times a day, I wouldn't bet money on that horse. I don't think that's a good option. So she now goes into the cyclical system of civilizational building and collapse, and kind of how her theory fits into that. So she says, if this were just something women were doing to sabotage each other, you'd expect men to be selected against it. You'd expect men to stand up and say, no, we built the civilization. We're not going to let you destroy it. You'd expect men to resist. But what we see instead is that men are going along with it. In fact, they're endorsing it. We see men celebrating the toxic masculinity narrative, declaring themselves male feminists. So men are actually becoming less masculine now. Women are choosing the less than ideal partners, which itself is a form of reproductive sabotage, and encouraging her to take a lower quality partner when she could potentially choose a higher quality partner. It's because all of their requirements, these things that women think they need to have in a partner, are completely wrong and misguided. Again, that's been shaped by this sabotage narrative, this reproductive suppressive narrative. Women are told to look for guys with the college degrees, look for someone making this much money, look for this, look for that. And so they have blinders on. They only want that because that's what's socially acceptable. They're not willing to look at the other options. Politics, right? They want everyone who believes their entire list of ideological beliefs. They're not willing to compromise or concede. And so anyone who's MAGA or Trump supporter, they're completely cast aside. They're not even given the light of day. And so this is, I think, a really, really great example of how women are sabotaging each other. Okay. So now she kind of gets into men going their own way in incel culture. She says, involuntarily celibate men are actually choosing to identify into these new subcultures now. It's not about being involuntary. These are not the men who can't get women. These subcultures, and also the men going their own way subculture as well, men are identifying into this and actually saying, look, the way the women are behaving at a social level, not necessarily individual women, but the behaviors that are now being endorsed and encouraged at a social level, means that we're not going to find women who want to be mothers, who want to be partners. And so men are beginning to just recognize themselves effectively around pulling themselves out of the dating pool and out of the reproductive pool. And this hurts women. This hurts women because men have the luxury of being able to do this. A guy who's, 27, 28, 29 years old now, he can look around the dating market and be like, no, okay, nothing good here. He can wait 20 years and then find someone younger later on. Once, kind of culture, the pendulum swings back and culture comes back to a desirable place where women are seeking to be mothers and wives again. Once that happens, like he can go back, he can have kids. It's the women who can't. So the women are the ones who are handicapping themselves, shooting themselves in the foot, and eliminating their opportunity to have children. The men recognize, we can wait. We can bide our time. We can focus on ourselves. And so that's exactly what they're doing. Okay. She dives into a couple things here with like passport bros and surrogacy. And now she talks about abortion. And I think this is really interesting because this, I think, is part also of the anti-natalist messaging. It's not just, kids are going to ruin your career. It's also the normalization of death and murder that I think is a part of this. And so the interviewer says, my view on abortion have changed a bit. I'm sure will continue to change as I have kids. But again, I think it's good to have it as an option who needs it. And so my views as well have changed. A decade ago, I'm grateful that I never had to make that decision. But a decade ago, I think I probably, unfortunately, would have been inclined to, again, just because of the social and the career and pressures and the impetus to finish college and do well and all that kind of stuff. I think there would have been a stronger push then for me to have an abortion. Whereas now it's like, absolutely off the table. It's because I've started to critically think of everything, of the entire feminist narrative, and really see what it's all about. But here, Dr. Sulikowski talks about the world that she grew up in. It was very much drilled into her. I can't even tell you by whom in particular. It was just understood. It was just understood that if you got pregnant, you had a child when you were still in high school or even in your early 20s, then that was it. Your job will be over. You would never go to university. You would never have a job. You would never be happy. No man would ever want you. So abortion was seen as the desirable option. And because of that, like she said, she can't remember who in particular told her this. Like, no one in particular told me this either. I grew up in a church where, people actually talk negatively about abortion, obviously. But it was part of the cultural zeitgeist and the messaging. And feminist women definitely created in this culture and with the social policing, this norm that abortion was acceptable and it was okay. And she says, I think that when it comes down to it, for a healthy, enlightened society, I think there really ought to be very few scenarios where abortion should be considered an acceptable option. I think that I agree with that. We've completely normalized it and made it the primary go-to option. You have an infinite number of ways to prevent an unwanted pregnancy. And of course, there are people who talk about exceptions with incest and abuse or, medical necessity. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the 19, 20-year-old, the young person who's in university, who's in high school and oops, accidentally gets pregnant. It's this day and age with all of the resources we have, all the protective measures you can put into place, all the things you can do to mitigate an unwanted pregnancy. The fact that abortion is still the primary option really tells you the anti-natalist message that's being pushed here. So she's talking about in Australia how you can have an abortion up until birth without cause, which is absolutely wild. So she says most people are not aware of this, that a woman who's 37 weeks pregnant, who could potentially go into labor at any point in time, can walk into a hospital and demand an abortion. And this is something feminist women definitely aren't critically thinking about. Like you might have, just in your own intellectual journey, but I don't think a lot of people are critically thinking about, like, what's the difference between a fetus that's 8 weeks old versus 16 weeks old versus one that's 37 weeks old versus one that is a day old, right? We've established these arbitrary and subjective lines around what is acceptable and what is not. And over time, this is deteriorating our society, and it's making it anti-natalist, not even just from the sorry if you hear that, by the way. My pups are crying. There's a squirrel outside. They want to go chase. But it's not even just like discouraging women from having children. It's anti-human. It's anti-life in general. So, where's the line? If 8 weeks is acceptable, then where's the line between 16 weeks? If 16 weeks is acceptable, what's the line with 24 weeks? If 24 weeks in the womb is acceptable, where's the line with 37 weeks? If 37 weeks is acceptable, where's the line with 1 day outside the womb, 2 weeks outside the womb, 2 years? If a young woman gets pregnant and she can't financially afford to have it carry out the baby and chooses to terminate it, what's the difference between her and a woman who has a baby, the baby is a year old, falls into hard financial times, and no longer can afford to take care of it either? If the woman with the fetus is allowed to terminate it, and we've said that as socially acceptable in society, why not the woman who has a 1-year-old? Why is she not allowed to terminate that child's life as well? And so this is my personal problem with abortion and how it's applied, is that you have to have an objective moral framework, and we have to agree that life is sacred, all life is sacred, and that murder is wrong. And so when you make exceptions, you change the goalposts, and over time, things that used to not be permissible suddenly become permissible. And that's how you get to a point where, okay, at one point in time, only 8-week abortions were okay, but now in some places up to 37 weeks, and apparently in Australia, that's okay. And then will we get to a point where your 1 or 2-year-old, if they're not meeting your standards, if you're stressed, if you can't afford to take care of them, can you put their life down? Can you euthanize a child? That's, I think, a really important question to ask. She does say here, in many states in America, there's a procedure called partial birth abortion, which is an abortion that's performed effectively during birth. I did Google this. It's outlawed in the United States. I don't know if any states are using this. There's like Supreme Court cases with this. If you know of any states where this is happening, please definitely share it in the comments. But to my knowledge, this is actually completely banned in the United States. But she says here, and this is what I was just saying, there was one academic article published a couple of years ago, maybe a year ago, arguing for post-birth abortion, which is exactly what it sounds like. So the speed with which the narrative of abortion is heading down is going towards an extreme end. And I think this is true. If we no longer recognize the sanctity of life, not just inside the womb, but outside the womb, you can arbitrarily decide who gets to live and who gets to die. And so she references in this conversation MAID, which is assisted dying in Canada. It's a program that's been applied there, where if you're terminally ill, you can ask for assisted suicide. And that is now being applied to people who are economic burdens on the system. So the elderly, for example. When you have state-managed healthcare and you have people who in their older years require more care and are more expensive, if they have dementia and they're a burden and they don't have any family to say no, what's stopping the state from euthanizing them? And so that's what's happening. So it's a very slippery slope. So you have to have a hard line. So that's the position I've taken, is abortion has to be wrong. Abortion has to be murder. Because if abortion is not murder, then murder becomes permissible for all levels of life. And that's no way to live. She says, I find it both amazing and appalling that you've got the pro-abortion crowd having moved so far along the continuum of opinion that they're now arguing that there's no difference between an abortion and killing a baby, because they simply want to justify killing the baby. And that's what it's all about. It's about making things justifiable, making things permissible, not necessarily because they're right. Okay. She goes on a little bit here, and then she says, with regard to the inconsistencies of feminist ideologies, she says the way they deal with cognitive dissonance is that they just don't think about the incoherency and the inconsistency, which is one of the reasons why they get quite upset when people try to point it out. So I think this ties back to political violence here in the U.S. and why we're seeing outbursts, really emotional and childish outbursts like we're seeing here in the United States. I think it's because of this, because there is this logical fallacy, this inconsistency, and people are pointing it out to them, screaming to these people like, what on earth are you doing? Why do you believe this? And they can't admit it, because the moment they admit it, like, the house of cards unravels. And I don't think these people are already emotionally unstable. I don't think they're ready to handle the truth. So for them, they would rather continue taking the blue pill and just accepting what they're told without questioning it because it's safer. It's frankly much safer for them. Okay, so I think this is towards... Oh, she talks about some... what is this? Comments that she's been getting. So the questioner asks about comments about good and evil and people who respond to some of her arguments. And she says, I'm trying to do is work out what's happening. First of all, accurately describing what's happening, because I think that when it comes to human behavior, that's actually a massive challenge on its own. Before you even get to the why, just getting to the what, I think is huge. So that's the first thing, coherent description. What is happening in our society? What has been happening over the last few decades? Who's doing that? And then getting down to the why. Why from a systems level explanation. So from an evolutionary perspective, what is this social system that has evolved? How does it actually work and maintain itself in the broader picture? And then from a proximate perspective, why individual people do what they do. And much of the female intrasexual competition, we all know women can be awful to each other, right? Much of the female rivalry is actually explicitly, overtly nasty. And any sort of misconception people might have that men can be evil but women can't be is just horrendously misguided. The idea that men have a monopoly on being capable of doing horrendous things, I think that's an important thing to dispel, because that does seem to be something that people still struggle with. So, this idea that men are toxic, men are bad, men are do evil things, but feminism and women aren't also toxic. And it's absolutely true. Like, misogyny may exist, but misandry also exists too. Okay. She says, one of the key tenets of what I'm saying is that the women who are being manipulated to have their birth rate suppressed, they're the victims in all of this. The ones who are actually having their reproductive output suppressed. So, middle class, working class women, women who just aspire to be part of the elite class, who are looking to them as role models. These women are the victims, and they end up not being mothers, not having children, or having very few children. These are the women who are the victims of this whole mechanism as everyone else. And I would even say too, like, women who are pushed to have kids later on in life, and it is more difficult, more challenging. There's more risk of complications. I'd say those women are victims as well. So then they talk about, okay, how do we increase our fertility? She was talking about Australia, but I think this applies to Western civilization as a whole. Like, what do we do? Like, okay, this is happening. Fertility rates are declining. Where do we go from here? And she says, if fertility rates don't rise, then the societies that we live in and are familiar with and have a lot of affection for are going to drastically change in a very short period of time. So we might not necessarily live through the full collapse, but we're going to start in our lifetime, start seeing the consequences of the change. And it's already underway. I mean, you have a rapidly aging baby boomer population. You have Gen Z, who isn't at replacement to meet the needs of baby boomers. Gen Alpha is far below that, and then Gen Beta that will be coming up soon. There's just not going to be enough of them. So at some point, we're going to invert the pyramid of life, if you will, and there will be far fewer young people at the bottom supporting a rapidly aging population at the top. And you can look at Japan as an example of this. So she says, civilizational decline happens over decades, sometimes even stretching out to centuries. It's a slow process. When you lose in the culture that was there before, it changes a little bit at first and then changes a little bit more. Then all of a sudden it changes within the lifetime of people, such that you then always have individual people who can remember how it used to be so incredibly different, and now it's something else. Tim Pool's talked about it on his Culture War podcast, so I want to give him full credit for this, because I think this is a really important idea, how we're just recycling culture at this point. So if you go and you look at the media, Netflix, movies, film, everything is being redone. So they're currently redoing Harry Potter. Like, Harry Potter was part of my childhood, and I'm 34, right? Like, I'm old, but not that old. Like, Harry Potter was a quintessential part of childhood of millennials who are all around today. It's something we will pass on to our children. But because there's nothing new coming from Hollywood, there's no new ideas, culture is dying, they're just redoing it, they're recasting it. And you see this, there's a Happy Gilmore too on Netflix. There was, instead of Full House, they had Fuller House. There's just been sequels and rehashing of things that already exist. So we're already seeing decline happening. You're not seeing the production of great works anymore. You're seeing a recycling. You're seeing music that samples music that already existed. You're seeing books and work and written work just rehashing what already exists. And you're not seeing the creation of anything new. And she says, we lose knowledge, we lose culture, we lose understanding. So if you don't want the social world that you are familiar with to be gone forever, then the world has to be sustained. So you need to produce people to sustain your culture. Certainly, the West can't be sustained by immigrants not coming from the West. People are not going to come in large numbers to countries that have completely different cultures to them and then fundamentally change their behavior in order to sustain the culture of the place that they're arriving at. It's just not how people are. This is absolutely true. And this is why the immigration debate is such a problem, because this has been the solution. If people, economically speaking, don't produce enough children to hit replacement rate, then the solution is to import people from other areas. Well, those people don't necessarily have the same culture and values and beliefs as you do. And we're already seeing this across, the United States and Europe and the UK. Especially, I think the competition with Islam and the West is particularly pronounced. You're seeing two different competitive societies, two different value systems, and they're completely unaligned. And you can't assimilate one into the other, and it's difficult to coexist. And so that's what's happening. So the inevitable conclusions are going to be either Western countries on the whole are going to change a lot, and they're very likely going to change in ways that people who are in them now would not like and would not want their children to live in. The alternative to that is to turn the taps off on immigration and then wear the tremendous economic cost of having a shrinking population, which is economically horrendous. That's also not a future anyone wants for them or their children. So it's a lose-lose. Either you bring in immigrants who change the culture and make it a place you don't want to live, or you close your borders and you deal with the consequences of not having enough children, and you still, deal with a place no one really wants to live. So from a macro societal level, it's really a simple decision. If we don't start having more children, then we've got two possible outcomes. One is the population goes down. The other is that the population gets maintained by immigration instead of reproduction. Both those results in a society that looks very different to the one we're living in now. So it's not necessarily collapse per se, but it's the destruction of what we know. So I talk nostalgically about, wanting to go back to the 1950s and, that typical Americana way of life. That's probably not feasible moving forward. So it's figuring out, okay, where do we go from here? And so she says, I think the closest we've come to seeing the brakes being put on antenatal narratives and the pronatal narratives being promoted is what's happening in the U.S. right now with the resurgence of popular conservatism. And I think this is true, but I think it has to go a step further. I think things are moving in the right direction. I mean, I'm clear evidence of this. I was a feminist just a few years ago, clearly on the conservative side now. So I'm living proof this is happening. But I think they have to go a step further. So I think you have to make motherhood cool again. And so conservatives have to challenge the liberal hold in institutions, in the media, movies, social media culture, all that kind of stuff. You have to get to a point where we're not disparaging trad wives anymore. We're holding women like Hannah Neeleman, I think she's a really good example, up as someone to aspire to. And I think we have to take anti-feminist natalists or anti-natalist feminists, and they have to be isolated and they have to feel social exclusion. Because if all of this is about being part of the team, being socially included, if that's what anti-natalism is about, then the opposite has to be true, where you take anti-natalism and you make it socially exclusive. So basically, conservatives have to be the cool people again, and they have to make it so that it's no longer palatable or desirable to be anti-natalist. And so they talk about here about economic incentives. So some countries have promoted a baby bonus, but she says that those don't work. Hungary's done it, and the Nordic countries have done it, and just financial incentives aren't working. So people get all the feminist narratives, internationalist narratives, and then if that happens, the baby bonus exists and the baby bonus can't. There's nothing to change on the other side of the ledger to shift people's opinions. So people's opinion responds to change in those things. So the interviewer says, clearly there needs to be a cultural change, and that's exactly right. There has to be a cultural change. So it has to be cool. There has to be social capital allocated to having kids, not just financial capital. And we have to change the narrative around college and career. And I think this is already happening with artificial intelligence and the cost of college. The value proposition of it has gone way down. Getting a credential for several $100,000s of debt in order to get a job that's not about to exist anymore. I think that's a losing bargain for Gen Z. And I hope more and more Gen Zers and their parents wake up to that. But I think the cultural shift is going to happen. Trades are going to supplant white collar jobs soon because, there won't be enough jobs for white collar workers to work. So I think traditionalism and traditional values will see a resurgence. I don't know if it'll be enough though, and quick enough to turn the tide of this. She says, and this goes back to kind of what I was just saying, that the American university system isn't salvageable given the state it's in, or that the education system isn't salvageable either. And so I think, there's going to be a surge of homeschooling in the future because of that. But again, we need to make these things cool and desirable again. Continuing to put college as the pinnacle of success, I don't think is a solution. So she says, I'm not sure what we can do, and I'm not sure how you socially engineer a cultural shift, because plenty of people have tried, and it's not easy to do. Usually people do it, it's in the direction of fascism, not in the direction away from fascism. It's not in the direction that we would like to go in. It's in the opposite direction. So it appears that it's quite easy to impose fascism on a culture, and that culture then and that society ends up crashing and burning and disappearing, and that's how fascism gets gone. And I think that's the risk, right? It's you can swing towards fascism on either direction. I don't think conservatives have the monopoly on that in terms of risk. I think the anti-natalist feminists and the liberal agenda also can swing that direction. I think they are going that direction. So she raises a very important concern here. Okay, so that is the end of that transcript. Thank you for spending your time going with me on that. That was a long transcript, but I think it was totally worth it because I think she brings up a lot of really interesting points about where we're at, where we're going, and why things are happening, and why this is manifesting the way it's manifesting. I think there's a lot of loose ends between the cultural conversation and dating and relationships and fertility and economics and politics and ideology, and I think this really ties things together. So if her theory is correct, if intrasexual competition is pushing elite women to manipulate and suppress the reproductive capabilities of women underneath them in order to advance their own line, and for them to be in a position so that down the road their offspring are the ones creating the new civilization that emerges out of the ashes of Western civilization. I think that's a big deal, and it really kind of shows where we're at. So I know there's a lot of guys that watch this. I would ask you to, and there's a lot of guys in the comments who are definitely men going your own way, definitely anti dating culture. Give women some grace. I would say give women some grace. They don't know what they don't know, and they're not aware of. And I think you have a role to play, and you can step in. And I'm not, there's many critiques of modern women dating culture, and I'm not saying that all women can be saved, but like I'm a great example. A couple of years ago, none of this would have resonated with me. Today, completely different person, completely changed, and that happened in the course of just a couple of years. So if I can do it, I think that's evidence to say there are probably some 27, 28, 29-year-old, 30-year-old women out there who are just as I was a couple of years ago, and they just need someone to come alongside them and just challenge their beliefs, challenge what they have to say or what they believe. And so if I can help do that by speaking as a woman, please share this with them and help them understand. I would love to be that resource for them. But also I'm just going to encourage you to recognize that if this theory is true, these women believe things and they don't actually know why they believe what they believe. And if you think someone has the potential of being a future mother and being a future wife, pursue it. Don't just write them off oh, they're crazy libtard, they don't know what they're talking about. They've been co-opted by this narrative, and they might not necessarily realize it, and they need, I hate to say it, but they need a Prince Charming to come in on his white horse and kind of usher them into reality and more conservative and traditional values, and alleviate some of those fears that they feel, because I think they become deep-seated. So alleviate some of the fears that they're not going to, their lives aren't going to come to an end. In fact, they could be enriched, that they could be better. Show them that working a girl boss 9-to-5 career isn't necessarily what it's made out to be, and help them see they believe that to be true because of the girl squad they've surrounded themselves with, and the Instagram culture and TikTok. It's not actually reality. It's not true. So don't write off women completely. Men and women need each other, and if we want Western civilization to be successful in the future, I think we both need to come together and work on this. This isn't just a one-sided game. And while you can go your own way and bide your time and wait, I don't think that's a winning strategy for Western civilization. So that would be my kind of hot take at the end. If you enjoyed this analysis, I would love it if you would like and subscribe, and again, share it with anyone you know. I appreciate you for sticking around with me for this long, and I'll see you in the next video.